What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 40 wide receiver rankings for week 6 of the NFL season. Instead of doing my top 30 and then updating them, I'm just going to push through the top 40 early in the week. I'm here in Florida, so not quite sure if I'm going to have power, over the next few days. So trying to get my top 40 out there. Hopefully I can continue making videos, but we'll just kind of wait and see at this point. But this video, wide receiver tier list, if you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. But let's just dive right into it here. I will just say the teams we have on bye this week, the Chiefs, Rams, Dolphins, Vikings. So definitely some notable wide receivers that, you're not going to have in your lineup this week. But in tier 1, I have Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Nabers, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jamar Chase, after like a slow couple games to start off the season, has just been on an absolute tear. I think it's very fair to have him as the wide receiver 1. Then I have CeeDee Lamb, who has been a little bit underwhelming, but obviously we know the talent is there, and this is a really strong matchup. The Lions have allowed the second most points per game to the wide receiver position, so I still think CeeDee Lamb is a great play. Then I have Malik Nabers. We're hoping he's able to return from his concussion. I thought he'd be able to go in week 4, earlier on last week, since they had the Thursday night game. He was not cleared. Hopefully he's good to go, and this is not something that lingers moving forward. And then the final guy in this tier is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Definitely just think he's stamped himself in this mid to high end wide receiver 1 range. And then I will just talk about a few players who I don't think are going to play this week due to injury, contract, trade stuff. The first one is Nico Collins. Seems like he's week to week with his hamstring injury, and I would expect him to miss at least one game here. Then we have Devontae Adams, who I guess is dealing with a hamstring, but this is more of just his situation here with the Raiders. Seems like they want to trade him. I don't think he's going to play, while they're negotiating with other teams. And then Christian Watson, I would just expect him to miss this week, so a bump up for some of those other Packers wide receivers. But looking at tier 2 here, I'm going to start it off with A.J. Brown, and I am expecting Brown to return this week. It seems like both him and Devonta Smith, at least the Eagles, are thinking they're going to be back here in week 6 here. Obviously, when A.J. Brown's healthy, he's a locked-in wide receiver 1, especially, with the bye weeks. A notable guy like Justin Jefferson. I do think A.J. Brown should be considered a top 5 play. Maybe there's some concern about him not being, completely 100%. But if you have A.J. Brown and it's a normal-sized league, he's obviously going to be locked into your lineup. Then after A.J. Brown, going with Jaden Reed, didn't necessarily have as nuclear a performance as we saw in week 1 and week 4 with Jordan Love, but still a solid game. He's been super impressive with Jordan Love at the quarterback position, the clear-cut number 1 target here for the Packers, so I like him in tier 2. Then I have DJ Moore, who's definitely just a massive riser. 1 for his, huge game in week 5, 5 for 105 and 2 touchdowns, and then also just the fact that this is a really strong matchup. The Jaguars have allowed the most points per game to the wide receiver position, and DJ Moore has kind of been in this weird spot where it seemed like he's been very underwhelming to start off the season, but he's been fairly consistent. Even through this Bears offensive struggles, he has still put up 10 plus PPR points in all 5 games. If this offense can get going, obviously he's going to be the wide receiver 1 here, coming off a great game, now has a great matchup. I think you fire up DJ Moore with a lot of confidence as a wide receiver 1. Then I have Drake London coming off of a monster game on Thursday Night Football, 12 for 154 and a touchdown. He also draws a pretty decent matchup here against the Panthers. The Falcons have the 4th highest implied points, so Vegas is expecting them to put up points. If they're scoring, I think Drake London is going to have a great week. And then the final 2 guys in this tier, they're going to be on the same team. It is Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Both guys have been super productive. Chris Godwin, the wide receiver 6 in points per game. Mike Evans, the wide receiver 13. Now here's the big red flag here for Mike Evans. This is the Marshawn Lattimore matchup, and historically, Mike Evans has not done well in this spot. It's not been a good time to play him for fantasy. The reason why I think it might be a little bit different this year is that the Bucs have been kind of creative in how they're using Mike Evans. Typically, in previous seasons, I guess aside from last year, you've had Chris Godwin, more in the slot, and Mike Evans was just locked outside. This year specifically, they're moving both these guys around, so Evans is actually getting moved into the slot a decent amount, so I don't know if we're going to have 100% of Evans snaps with Marshawn Lattimore on him. Now, I guess you run the risk of them just getting into a brawl and him getting ejected, but I'm not quite as scared of this matchup as I would have been in previous seasons. Maybe that's delusional. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I do think the usage has been interesting here for Evans. He obviously has the touchdown upside, so I still think he's a fine play. If you're completely scared off of it, I get it, right? It hasn't, panned out well from in previous seasons, but personally, I think he'll be fine this year. And then looking at tier 3, starting off here with Brian Thomas Jr., the dude has been an absolute stud. He's the wide receiver 12 in points per game. He's put up 21 PPR points in back-to-back games. And it's 5 games into his NFL career. Theoretically, he could just continue balling out, continue building on the season. If you drafted Brian Thomas Jr., it feels like he's an auto lock in your lineup every single week. So I feel great about Thomas Jr. moving forward. Then I have Stephon Diggs. Like I said earlier, this is going to be assuming that Nico Collins is out. With Collins likely out, Stephon Diggs will likely be operating here as the wide receiver 1. Still a very talented wide receiver, attached to CJ Stroud. Definitely a strong play here, which is why I have him in my top 12. Then I have DK Metcalf. Not the best game against the 49ers. I feel like this is kind of just where he's settling in here as a fringe wide receiver 1. Then I have T. Higgins, who has been very solid over the last couple of weeks. Huge week 5, 9 for 83, 2 touchdowns. He's being heavily targeted over the last 2 weeks. He has commanded 24 total targets. Even though he's the wide receiver 2 here, this is something I talked about heading into the season, early on when, he's come back from injury, not putting together the best games. When him and Joe Burrow are healthy, T. Higgins can easily put up fringe wide receiver 1 production. That's what we've seen over the last couple of weeks here. So he's my wide receiver 14. Then I have Chris Olave coming off a down game. This is a pretty decent matchup here against the Buccaneers. They've allowed the 6th most points per game to the wide receiver position. So I like this spot for Olave, but I'm definitely not as optimistic about this offense as I was after 2 weeks, right? They dropped back-to-back 40-point games. It was maybe they've turned a corner. Obviously, you're not expecting them to replicate that every single week, but the last 3 weeks, they've really come back down to earth here, which is obviously not ideal for Olave. And then after Olave, I'm going with Garrett Wilson here. Coming off a big game, 13 for 101 and a touchdown. This dude commanded 22 targets in week 5, which is absurd. This might be one of, if not the last week where we have Garrett Wilson here without Devontae Adams. So, hopefully he's able to put together a big game here. But, the 22 targets is great, but it seems like him and Rodgers still aren't quite on the same page. Obviously, catching 13 of 22 isn't ideal. So I still think he's a nice play here, but probably not going to be what we, expected when we were drafting him in the first round. And then I'm going with Deontay Johnson. Had his first down game with Andy Dalton. I still think he'll be fine moving forward, but it's just a little bit of a reminder that the floor is still fairly low. Obviously, Dalton raises the ceiling, but this team can definitely still throw out clunkers offensively. And then the final guy in this tier, Devonta Smith, going up against the Browns. Like I talked about with A.J. Brown, expecting both these wide receivers back. With both these guys in the lineup, I think Devonta Smith is just a very solid wide receiver 2 play. Now, pivoting into tier 4, I'm going to start off this tier with Rashid Shaheed. And this might seem high for Rashid Shaheed, but I feel like we have to put some respect on his name here. He had the one game where he put up 0 points, had the goose egg, but in 4 of his 5 games, he has put up 15 plus PPR points. So aside from the goose egg, he's been 15 plus every single week, and he's no longer just this big play, deep threat, boomer bust option. I know he had the one bust week, but 20 total targets in the last 2 weeks. I think Rashid Shaheed is a solid weekly play, and I'm going to give him his respect here heading into week 6 against the Bucs. Then my wide receiver 20, I have Terry McLaurin going up against the Ravens. Terry's been super productive over the last 3 weeks. He's had a couple 100-yard games. In the one where he didn't go for 100, I think he was 50 and a touchdown. So 3 straight very solid weeks. Jane Daniels playing at a very, very high level. And obviously it's not the best matchup going up against the Ravens, but we just saw the Bengals wide receivers completely torch this defense. They're 6.5-point dogs. Might be a fairly pass-heavy game script. So I'm not really scared off of Terry here. I still think he's a solid wide receiver 2 play. Then I have Marvin Harrison Jr., and I think through 5 weeks, we need to kind of reframe our expectations here. He was drafted in that fringe wide receiver 1 territory on some platforms. He was going off the board as the wide receiver 9, and he's been fine through 5 weeks, right? He's the wide receiver 25 in points per game. He's a rookie. That's fine production. It's just that we were probably expecting unreasonable things coming into the season. You also have guys like Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., who are just like completely killing it, but that shouldn't, reflect negatively on Marvin Harrison Jr. I just feel like him and Kyler aren't 100% on the same page yet. He's only sitting at like a 49% catch rate, which is not ideal. That should improve. I think, moving forward, rest of season, he would be ranked higher than this. But for this specific week, until we see them start to really connect offensively, I think he's going to be more in this like mid to back end wide receiver 2 range. And then the last two guys in this tier, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk going up against the Seahawks here. Deebo hasn't been great since returning from injury. We finally saw a big game out of Brandon Ayuk, but I do think both these wide receivers have been a little bit underwhelming to start off the season. Hopefully they start to pick it up here. But for this week, back-end wide receiver 2s. Now looking at tier 5, going to start off this tier with Jamison Williams. He is the wide receiver 24 in points per game. I have him here ranked as the wide receiver 24. He has put up 14 or more points in 3 out of 4 games. He is a little bit boomer bust. He doesn't have the highest volume floor, but the usage has been somewhat fun. Obviously, he has the big playability on a very, very good offense. Then I have Zay Flowers going up against the Commanders. This might seem low for Zay Flowers, but I do think he's kind of approaching that boomer bust territory, which isn't ideal because he's not exactly like a big play, huge touchdown threat, but it's more just in terms of like boomer bust in terms of the volume. So in 3 games, he has had 10 plus targets. In his other 2 games, he has had 4 or under. So in these game scripts where the Ravens are going head early, they're just able to run it out. They're going to be super, low volume passing. That's where Zay Flowers is just not going to produce. In the games where they're trailing or it's a shootout like against the Bengals, he is going to command a lot of volume. The issue here is they're like 6.5 point favorites against the Commanders. Now that does seem a little bit disrespectful to the Commanders with how productive they've been through, 5 weeks here. But if they get an early lead and Lamar's passing volume is low, the floor is fairly low here for Zay Flowers. So just something to keep in mind. Then I have Tank Dell going up against the Patriots. He is lined up to be the number 2 target here with Nico Collins likely out. I talked about Tank Dell as a buy low. I'm a believer in the talent, but we're really going to need to start to see something here. Like if he goes out and just does nothing in this matchup with no Nico Collins, it is going to be pretty disappointing, but I do have faith in him. The talent's there. Obviously, he has the quarterback play. I think the opportunity should follow here in week 6. Then these next 3 guys, kind of, some players I just got to put some respect on with their starts to the season. Starting off here with Darnell Mooney, he is the wide receiver 19 in points per game. He has put up 14 plus PPR points in 3 of his last 4. He is going to be like a top target on this Falcons offense, likely their number 2 target behind Drake London. He looks good. Pretty decent matchup here against the Panthers. I think it's fair to rank him as like a high-end wide receiver 3. Then we have Wan'Dale Robinson, who is averaging 9.4 targets per game. This guy's commanding crazy volume. He's doing it with Neighbors in and out of the lineup. And he also has a pretty high floor. His worst game was 9.8 PPR points. So pretty high floor, definitely playable as a wide receiver 3. And then my final guy in this tier is going to be Jacoby Myers. Looks like the wide receiver 1 here for the Raiders, probably rest of season with Devontae Adams likely gone. Had a decent game, even though he was drawing the Pat Surtain matchup. Not sure if he was covered by him the whole game, but good to see him do something in a spot where a lot of other wide receivers have not. So I think he's definitely playable as like a mid-tier wide receiver 3 option. Quarterback play, obviously up in the air. Not the greatest matchup, but I don't think the Steelers defense is like, insane or like amazing or anything. And then looking at tier 6 here, some interesting names, some proven guys, some unproven guys. I'm going to start off this tier with Dontavian Wicks. This might be controversial. Seemed like he had a great spot here in week 5. Did not pan out. But he still commanded 7 targets. He's earning targets at a very high level. I talked about this, I think maybe in the buy low or sell high video as like a potential trade target for maybe one of the sell highs. I think that's what it was. But his ball skills are not great. He's not coming away with as many as you'd like. I think he's had like 5 drops, which isn't ideal. But I still think you look at this wide receiver situation. Obviously, Jaden Reed, wide receiver 1, no questions asked. You have Christian Watson, who I don't think is going to play this week. And then you have Romeo Doubs, who has been the route leader, but is now like getting suspended by the team. It seems like he's going to be back this week, but I don't know if you go from like skipping practice, getting suspended a game, and then just getting launched right back into like the wide receiver 1 in routes. It's especially funny because you could make the argument that Romeo Dobbs is like the wide receiver 4 on this roster, behind Jaden Reed, Watson, Dontavian Wicks, but he's the guy who's consistently gotten the most routes. So it's kind of funny that he's complaining about his role, despite getting the most playing time. But I still think this is a spot where Wicks is probably going to be slotting in as the wide receiver 2. If we're getting news like Watson's playing or like Romeo Dobbs is just going to step right back into his previous role, then I'd probably move Wicks down here. But the target earning ability is there. It's a very good passing attack. I'd still trust him as like a wide receiver 3. And then after Wicks, I have JSN. Now, if you want the safer play, if you want safety floor, that would definitely be JSN over Dontavian Wicks. But JSN is just severely lacking in upside. He's not commanding targets at a super high level. His target share is not where you want it. He is not getting targeted heavily in the red zone. I know he got his first touchdown, but through 5 weeks, those opportunities really haven't been there. He is not being used down the field. So the floor, I guess, is fine, but the ceiling is really just not there for JSN. Also, not a good matchup here against the Niners. Then I have Amari Cooper, and he's someone I talked about as a sell high after week 3. I got a lot of pushback in that video, gotten a lot of pushback on where I've had him ranked. And my argument has always been that, like, the volume is going to be there, right? They've been fairly pass heavy because they're in trailing game scripts and they, need to be putting up points. He's averaging 9.4 targets per game, but it just doesn't matter if the quarterback play is terrible. Deshaun Watson is not playing good enough. This is not a good offense. Amari Cooper's also had his drop issues in there, so it's, he's not entirely blameless in this situation. But even though the volume's there, like the production just is not following because the yardage is not there, the touchdown opportunities are not there. So I guess he's playable as like a wide receiver 3. It's a pretty decent matchup here against the Eagles, but it's hard to have a lot of confidence in this Browns passing attack. Then I have Christian Kirk, and I am expecting him to take a little bit of a step back fantasy-wise with Evan Ingram back in the lineup. It looks like Ingram is going to make his return this week. I just think it's going to cut into the volume of Christian Kirk, which is going to, limit his floor and his weekly ceiling. Then I have George Pickens, and this Pickens situation is very odd because he went out Sunday Night Football, had a 65% route participation. Now, after the game, Mike Tomlin said that, they were just, managing his snaps. They were trying to, decrease his usage to increase his productivity. And either he's telling the truth, which is delusional, right? George Pickens, by far their best offensive weapon. I mean, you look at the wide receiver room, it's horrific. The running backs aren't doing anything. Cordell Patterson, Jalen Warren, those guys were out. Najee Harris seems like he has no juice. Pickens is the only guy with some upside on that offense. So if that's the legit reason and he's playing 65 or, running 65% of the routes, that is inexcusable. That is insane. If he's lying and, Pickens is in the doghouse or in trouble for something, then that's also not ideal. So it's just tough here with Pickens. The talent is there. If he had a better role, he'd probably be higher in this tier, but the Steelers' passing attack isn't super exciting. Honestly, just a very frustrating situation. The explanation to me made no sense. I almost hope he's in the doghouse because if he's not, it's the coaching incompetence is just insane. To act like playing a dude, 65% route participation is going to somehow increase his productivity. And if this is something they're sticking with, there was no productivity out of George Pickens in that game. So clearly it's not working. The dude should have, pretty much an 100% route participation. He's the only one on that offense that can basically do anything, exciting. You have Pat Freiermuth, who's a solid tight end, but in terms of explosive plays, which they need, that should be George Pickens. So a very odd situation. Hopefully it bounces back, but the Tomlin, Arthur Smith thing, it's just odd. And then the final guy in this tier, Khalil Shakir going up against the Jets. Missed week 5 with an ankle injury. Looks like he's day-to-day. Not a great matchup here against the Jets. They've allowed the 6th fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. But, this is a spot where Khalil Shakir looks like the wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen. And then tier 7, not my favorite tier, but if you're desperate, I get it. Ladd McConkey going up against the Broncos. Not quite sure if he's going to be shadowed by Surtain because they kind of move him around, get him in the slot. He looks like he's, a very good player. It's just, is the passing volume going to be there? Then we have Rome Odunze. Hasn't been great aside from the one boom game with no Keenan Allen, but great matchup here against the Jaguars. Could be a big passing day. Cortland Sutton going up against the Chargers. Does Broncos passing attack, maybe figuring some things out? Sutton really didn't do anything in week 5, but overall, probably a positive sign if this, offense can score. Then we have Calvin Ridley. Just a tough, passing situation here with the Titans. Don't know if it's going to be Levis or Rudolph. Either way, probably not great. And then the final guy here is Michael Pittman. This is going to be assuming that Anthony Richardson is the quarterback. And like my ranking of Michael Pittman will be night and day based on who the quarterback is. Like if it's Flacco, he's probably a top 24 guy, probably in like that tier 5 area, maybe even tier 4. But with Richardson, he's had 3 full games, hasn't scored 8 PPR points. I don't think it's a coincidence that right when Flacco comes in, plays the bulk of week 4, and then all of week 5, all of a sudden Michael Pittman's producing until Richardson, and I guess them together prove that he can support Pittman. Pittman can put up decent production with Richardson at quarterback. I just have no confidence starting him. So that's kind of where I'm at here with Michael Pittman. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 40. Any questions, drop them down below. Stay tuned for the running backs coming out today. Defenses should be out today. And then quarterbacks, tight ends probably tomorrow. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.